Oh, hi, Mark Pearson, Executive and Artistic Director of the College Light Opera Company, coming to you from the billiard room of Highfield Hall, now open with limited hours for visitors. Welcome to On the Clock, our weekly lecture series. On the Clock is made possible through our partnership with Highfield Hall and a generous grant from the Woods Hole Foundation. This week, Professor Travis Newton, an alum of our own CLOC orchestra, will be talking to us about community outreach in the arts. Let's hear what he has to say.
Good afternoon. My name is Travis Newton, and I am so happy to be with you all here. We're on the clock. I am a proud alum of CLOC. In fact, I will just for giggles show you a little photo that I dug up. Weren't we adorable? The orchestra from 2001 on the familiar staircase there. Brings back lots of memories, and I'm happy to be here sharing my thoughts on community engagement in musical organizations today. A little bit of background on me is that I am a violinist and conductor, and I played violin in the CLOC orchestra, majored in violin performance in my undergrad, and then went on to a career both in arts administration and as a musician. I continue to perform now. Something I tell students is you don't have to pick one or the other. And so what I'm going to talk about today is a topic that I'm very passionate about. And again, that is community engagement. It's a term that gets tossed around quite a bit in our universe of arts administration and arts organizations. But especially right now, given what arts organizations, including CLOC, are trying to do to stay relevant and stay connected to their audience and to their community at this time, I think it's especially relevant to have a conversation about community engagement. So what I'm going to focus on is community engagement in musical organizations. And of course, CLOC being a musical theater organization, I think fits nicely into that category. So, when arts administrators like Mark and Beth and all the leaders at CLOC are putting together the season and doing lots of planning, they do lots of things to get those T's crossed and I's dotted. They do marketing, artistic planning, they cultivate donors, they do public relations. I'm sure they do some grant writing to raise funds. Obviously, they're performing. The season is something that needs to be managed. They need to develop their board of directors. They need to manage the finances, which of course is paramount, operating the venue, etc. For me, one of the connective tissue items through all these things is the idea of community. And for me, an arts organization is only as effective as its engagement with its community. After all, arts organizations in the US are largely not-for-profit organizations that have the privilege of not paying income tax and of receiving donations that are tax deductible for the donor. And so with that privilege of being a tax-exempt organization comes responsibility of serving the greater good. And so that's what I'm really going to focus on today, which is serving the community. And so one of the people who I really follow on this topic and who has written a book on the topic is Doug Borwick. And I would invite you to check this book out. It is on Amazon and wherever you buy your books. Maybe have a local bookstore that does curbside pickup. That would be even better. Doug is a wonderful author and scholar when it comes to community engagement. And so he wrote this book a few years ago, and it's called Building Communities, Not Audiences. And I think that title really says it all in terms of what he's getting at, is that, if arts organizations approach community engagement as purely a way to sell more tickets then they're not going to be as successful as they would be if they approach it from the idea of simply building meaningful, long-lasting relationships with their community. And so the definition that Doug came up with for community engagement, and I love this, I put this photo here of the Melbourne Symphony because it's just a really simple wave from a musician on stage. But I don't know about you, but this doesn't happen normally. Musicians, including myself, I put myself in this category, we stand up at the end of the concert and maybe we smile, but we just stand there. And this musician, I'm assuming, took it upon herself. I don't think anyone said, hey, why don't you wave to the audience? Seems like she just did it. And it just is so inviting and engaging. And so Doug's definition of community engagement is a process whereby institutions enter into mutually beneficial relationships with other organizations, informal community groups, or individuals. So in terms of this definition, the place where I think some organizations struggle is in two major areas. First, I'm going to highlight the word process. So obviously process implies a sustained, ongoing effort versus isolated programs or initiatives. Sometimes I call them drive-by experience, where you're literally, or maybe drive through would be better, where you're literally, passing by, oh yes, we're being engaging, and then it's done. So it needs to be ongoing, and it needs to be something that is maintained over time. Second, mutually beneficial is also important, and that of course implies that both parties in this effort are getting something out of it, right? We all know how it feels to be in a relationship or a friendship or any kind of interaction with someone or some organization where it really doesn't feel equal in terms of both sides getting something out of that relationship. And so, a lot of times, organizations do what they call outreach, which I won't say it's a dirty word or a bad word, but it does imply a certain amount of a one-sided approach, right? Where we're reaching out to you as a community member, which is great. Don't get me wrong, that's not a bad thing, but it's not so much of a conversation. It's we're reaching out to you and doing something for you, or providing some service that you need, right? And so there's also this implication that whoever you're reaching out to is less fortunate or less knowledgeable or whatever, that could also be interpreted as being a little bit condescending. So I personally try to stay away from the word outreach, and so that's my outreach soapbox, because it does tend to be mostly one-sided. And so in terms of Borwick's framework of what the various components are of community engagement, and I've mentioned a few of them, but I just want to tick through these and illuminate a little bit. First of all, it's that there's a pre-existing relationship that either your organization and another organization has, or that your organization and individuals have. Somehow there's a relationship that's been built over time. And so, he doesn't talk about how long the relationship needs to be in place, but the whole idea behind this particular bullet point, I think, is that you are approaching this effort from a place of strengthening a relationship that already exists, as opposed to saying, well, we need this and we want this, so let's go talk to this organization and we could get it done that way. It's really more to emphasize the fact that it should be a sustainable, longer term approach. which of course will have more of an impact. The second, which we've already discussed, is that there's mutual benefit for both sides. We know, again, how it feels to not have that. And so there are lots of reasons why I think this is a good idea. One is, of course, that both sides need to have some skin in the game and need to be genuinely feeling like they're going to get something out of this arrangement, so that, or this arrangement doesn't really sound like the right word, but this relationship, this project, initiative, that they're both going to benefit. Otherwise, you're going to end up with one side doing all the work, and the other side not. The analogy that I use with students when I talk about this a lot of the time is, we've all done group activities, group work, and this, of course, happens in the real world outside of school as well, where we're working on projects in a team, and some people just aren't bought into it, aren't interested, don't see what they're getting out of it, and therefore are not as engaged as they could be. So you want to make sure that both sides have some skin in the game and also have some kind of benefit. Doesn't need to be financial. It could be anything of value to them, whether it's an individual or an organization or a group of individuals. There needs to be also some collaboration when it comes to designing and implementing whatever your project is. So if it's a partnership with a school district as an arts organization, instead of going to the school district and saying, "Hey, this is our idea, will you help us do it?" Saying, "Well, this is our mission, this is what we're trying to achieve as an organization. We feel like there could be an opportunity to work together. Let's talk about it." And listening, right? So asking community groups, community members, what it is that they're interested in, what it is that they need. These are all questions that get asked on grant applications. What community need are you fulfilling? What problem are you solving through this project? So instead of having to kind of concoct an answer to that question, it's better to have a real answer that's been arrived at collaboratively with your partner in the project. And then when it comes to actually doing the project, also making sure that there's collaboration there as well, so that, again, it's not one side doing most or all of the work. And then also having some kind of plan to maintain the relationship after the community engagement activities or projects have concluded, so that it's not just a one and done kind of situation, not the drive-through operation that I mentioned earlier, and so that it's an ongoing plan to at the very least keep in communication as other opportunities present themselves. So in terms of kind of narrowing down a little bit to think about how this might look in an orchestra, this is an iconic photo, of course, of Leonard Bernstein, who really pioneered and popularized the young persons concerts with the New York Philharmonic. And so he was obviously, Renaissance man when it comes to being a conductor and composer and pianist and writer and just an incredible musician and person. And so I know that CLOC, I'm assuming CLOC has done many of his works over time. And so I'll let Beth Burrier be the expert on that. But in any case, Leonard Bernstein pioneered the young persons concerts, which happen in orchestras all across the country. So there are a number of things that orchestras tend to call community engagement. Sometimes they call them education activities, but they fall into a number of different categories. You've got your education concerts, which again, the young persons concerts would fall into that, where you bus in a bunch of school kids, or maybe you even go to their school and the full orchestra plays various pieces Often there's a theme. Maybe they do a piece like Peter and the Wolf. Maybe they do a Young Person's Guide to the Orchestra, Benjamin Britten. Those types of things to demonstrate the instruments of the orchestra. Sometimes it's focused on storytelling or magic or superheroes, or I mean, lots of different theme possibilities there. Another way that orchestras do what they call community engagement, and note that I'm saying they call it community engagement, is small ensemble performances. And they send ensembles out into the community, often to libraries, to schools, to community centers, all over the place to perform. And there's string quartets and brass quintets and percussion ensembles, and sometimes they even have sort of a non-classical type configuration, like a rock ensemble, which is fun. And they get out into the community and they do these performances for the community, and that's a way for them to be a little bit more mobile, right? And to really interact with people on a more intimate scale. Runouts, which I think is a hilarious term. I'll tell you what it is first, and then I'll tell you why I think it's hilarious. So a runout for an orchestra is where the orchestra goes and plays a concert somewhere relatively close to their home base. So it's not necessarily a tour, but they literally go out to another venue, perform a concert, and then go back home. I think it's funny because it implies that you're running out and that then you're running back to your concert hall home. And so orchestras do this quite a bit, especially regional orchestras that perform in multiple venues, sometimes regularly, sometimes once or twice a year outside of their home performance venue. Sometimes orchestras have a youth orchestra, which is part of their operations. And sometimes the youth orchestra might be a separate organization that's affiliated with the professional orchestra. But this is a great opportunity, obviously, for young people to perform at a very high level with their peers. And they typically perform repertoire that a professional orchestra would play. And it's great because these students can get together with the best from the various school districts around the area and perform again at a really high level. And it's a great training opportunity for students. Sometimes orchestras offer ticket discounts for students, for educators, for community members. That sometimes falls under the community engagement umbrella. Sometimes they hold open rehearsals where students or community members can come in and sit in the audience during a rehearsal and experience the rehearsal from the audience perspective, but get a little bit of a window into the rehearsal process. I always thought it would be even more engaging to do that if the conductor wore a microphone so that he or she, as they were communicating to the orchestra about things to improve, the students in attendance could actually listen to that feedback and hear the actual rehearsal process. So you can imagine why some conductors might not love that idea, but I think it would be fun. And then sometimes orchestras will produce their own media. They'll have podcasts, they'll have a YouTube channel, they'll use media as a way to tell their story and to engage with their audience. And so, earlier I said that these are things that orchestras call community engagement. And I think to varying degrees, they're all wonderful things, and they're things that orchestras do because they love spreading the gospel of their music and their operations and their mission. But I just think that the ideas of the previous slide of making sure that things are mutually beneficial and that there's a sustained relationship and all those things, collaborative design and implementation, are things to make these opportunities even better moving forward. So moving along here, I'd like to illustrate some of the characteristics of what I think is good community engagement through a brief case study here. So Cincinnati Symphony has had a relatively recent turnaround, and part of that turnaround for the organization was financial, part of it was artistic, but one of the things they did during that turnaround time that they started back in 2013 is something called luminosity. And I'm sure many of you have seen this type of presentation where projections are digitally mapped onto a structure and interact seemingly with the architecture of that structure. And so they did this luminosity back starting in 2013. And it was originally devised as a way to engage the community around the appointment of their new music director, Louis Langray, who is still there. I think recently re-upped his contract. And the project clearly tapped into a community need because 35,000 people turned out over the first 2 nights back in 2013. They had no idea what to expect. You know, I've had conversations with the marketing director and with the president of, at the time, of the Cincinnati Symphony. They just didn't know what to expect. You know, they they wanted to do something big and splashy, and boy, did they. And the community really responded. The event was held in the historically challenged Over the Rhine neighborhood, and the event was described as a tipping point for that neighborhood. And all of a sudden, the Cincinnati Symphony became a catalyst for community building in their area. The event was not devised as an audience building initiative. They didn't sell tickets the first year. They didn't even issue free tickets. They just did it and people showed up. The second year, they had to issue tickets, free tickets, so that they could do a little better crowd control. And when they did that, of course, when they issued the free tickets, they got people's contact info, and who could blame them for that? And they were then able to convert between 9 and 13% of that audience to attend an orchestra concert that next season. And so, although it wasn't devised, you know, back to the Doug Borwick book title, Building Communities, Not Audiences, it really seems to have been devised as a community building event, but it wound up really helping them with their audience development initiatives. And so I wanted to play a little taste of luminosity for you. Also sprach Zarathustra. I just think that's a fun, I mean, it's just fun, right? It's bright lights and synchronized to the music and just a fun thing. So, as I mentioned, one of the challenges of good community engagement is resisting the urge to think of it as purely audience development initiatives. Now, notice I use the word purely. Of course, organizations need to survive. They need to make money. They need to sell tickets. Otherwise, they're not going to be around for us to enjoy. But shifting back to the premise of not-for-profit organizations and remembering that they should be working for the greater good, not simply purely for the benefit of the organization and the people whom it employs. And I think Doug really does say it best. Communities do not exist to serve the arts. The arts exist to serve communities. And so often I think organizations fall into the trap of saying, well, you know, if people just knew how great we are, then they would come and see us. Or if we just get the word out, then and they know about it, then that should be enough. But it actually isn't. It isn't enough. And arts organizations have to continually ask themselves, what are we doing to serve the community? And then in turn, of course, the community will support you. But if you approach it from the opposite direction, then it doesn't tend to work very well. So something that I think also happens is that we, as well-intentioned members of the community, we often launch initiatives that we think will be good for the community without actually asking the community what they need or want. And thankfully, something we have going for us is that musicians are excellent listeners. We are used to listening to conductors drone on, giving us advice, all this nitpicky detail that we as musicians are used to listening to from conductors and from our colleagues and our teachers and everyone. And so we really need to put those listening skills to work in order to engage with our communities. This, of course, is Simon Rattle with looks like some students that I pulled from the Berlin Philharmonic website, unless the musicians in the Berlin Philharmonic are just getting younger and younger every day. So in these conversations where we're really listening to the community, that's where community outreach becomes community engagement. So organizations come up with lots of reasons why or why not to engage with their communities. Some of the reasons they might come up with to engage would be to help with community development, to enhance their brand, to raise money, to develop their audience, to develop their board, maybe to boost staff and artist morale. So, you know, these are all good reasons to engage, but they might also come up with some, not might, they do naturally come up with some reasons why they might be a little more hesitant to engage with their community. Might have to do with their artistic vision being compromised, or their perception that it would be. Just general resistance to change that we find in any organization. They tend to like to stick to whatever system they've established. Survivalism, so, you know, if we collaborate with that organization, then are they going to take our mailing list, and are they going to contact our donors? They might think, you know what, we're doing outreach, we're good, we're making the community a better place by reaching out. Time is huge. So the fact that organizations have limited resources, time being one of those resources, is a real truth and cannot be ignored. And also, it's not easy. It's a hard thing. Engaging with your community, as I've said, is hopefully a sustained process. And with any relationship, you have your ups and downs, and you have your times when people aren't getting back to you, and you have issues of resource sharing, and you have issues of staff time, and it's just not easy. And so sometimes that's a reason why engagement doesn't always work. And so I think one of the toughest nuts to crack here has to do with the artistic vision of an orchestra, for example. Typically, as is the case with CLOC, seasons are programmed way ahead of time. In orchestras, at least, um, and I do remember getting something. I just recalled this from CLOC getting feedback on the season, which I thought was incredible, because most of the time orchestras don't do that, and they program their season without much, if any, input from the community. Often we assume that gathering feedback from the audience or the community would somehow lessen the artistic integrity of the final product. Um, so I don't agree with that. I feel like, while the orchestra administration certainly and the music director knows what's artistically viable, they also should factor in what the community is interested in. And they might be surprised by what they hear. And so I would ask, maybe, are we giving our audiences enough credit as we are thinking through these challenges? Is it possible that the audience could come up with an idea that we hadn't thought of? Or, are 1,000 heads better than one or two? And so I think that's something to consider, and to not assume that if you listen to the community and your audience, that somehow you're selling out as an organization. So what does all this mean for those who might be interested in working within an organization? We often hear that orchestra managers and arts managers wear many hats. Here's a photo of the Rochester Philharmonic in Eastman Hall, or Kodak Hall at Eastman. So the primary concern of the leaders of any performance-oriented musical organization is what happens here on the stage, right here. But enabling and supporting artistic excellence does take a village. It takes a lot of people to work together. These are some of the functional areas of arts organizations, many of which I know you all are familiar with, because there are also functional areas of your organization. And so it may be logical or seem logical to look at these things: artistic planning, marketing, fundraising, financial management, operations. Of course, there are others. And when you're thinking about community engagement, to simply add that to the list, right? Well, okay, this is another thing that we do. However, I really feel like community engagement should be central to all conversations within an orchestra. Whether for-profit or not-for-profit, traditional or non-traditional, my view is that all aspects of an organization's operations should have the community squarely in the center, because after all, that's why we are here as an organization, to serve the community. So making sure that we're not just answering the questions of what or how, but why are we doing what we are doing as an organization, and are we serving the community who regularly interacts with our organization, but also the ones who don't. So there are lots of statistics out there about the percentage of the community that attends the orchestra or the opera, or these kind of quote unquote legacy traditional classical organizations. It's not very high. It's not a high percentage of the population. And so how do we start conversations with those members of the community who are not in our audience, and ask them what they're interested in, and figure out a way to serve them, because after all, they are members of the community. And so back to the conflict between accessibility and artistic value. Of course, this is I think, a very silly question that you would have to choose between whether something is good artistically or engaging. There are lots of examples of artists who are both. And so we have to change this question and make sure that whatever we do as an organization is both good and engaging, because build it and they will come does not work anymore, hasn't for a while, and especially now, post-COVID, people's behaviors and the way that they consume content is shifting to be much more digital. And so we're really going to have to up our game in terms of what our value proposition is as an industry to convince people to come back in person to experience what it is that we're doing, because of course we all know that live music and live theater and live performance is where it's at. That's what it's all about. And so this is fine. It's great to have this technology to be able to communicate, but it's no substitute for the real thing. And so I want to thank you very much for having me, and I would also invite you to look me up on LinkedIn, and I look forward to our conversation. Thanks very much.
On the Clock is part of our larger series, Digital Clock. Digital Clock is made possible by a generous gift from Phil and Liz Gross. If you'd like to learn more about our programming or how you can become a supporter, visit us at collegelightoperacompany.com. Tune in again next week for another lecture in our series On the Clock.